Hello everyone. I'm doing a video for chapter 2. First of all, great job. You should be in week 2. I hope that these videos accomplish a couple of things. Let me move this over first of all, I'll give you a summary of what you need to do this week. And second of all, just be a little more personable than you looking through a PowerPoint presentation. Remember, if you ever have questions, to go ahead and use the FAQ section in the discussion board area. I'll check those on Mondays and Wednesdays. You can also email me. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. Make sure at this point you should have emailed me about your background check. If you have one, great. You should check with Mr. Runyon's office. Make sure that it is current and that they do have access to it. If you didn't have one, by now you should have done one and be waiting for the results. Either way, you should have emailed me what you've done and keep me updated on that, because you must have that background check before you can do your observation. The next part is finding out where you need to do your. So make sure that you've looked around your area to see what schools are in the area. There is some paperwork in the observation folder that if your district has questions, you can print one out. You can also give them my email address, and I can also help them out with understanding that at that point too. Remember, if you're in the Warrensburg area and want to go to Warrensburg, email me. By now you should have done that already, but if not, get it to me like today. That way I can get you some information on who you might go to. And go ahead and get those scheduled. Reminder, June is probably the best month to get them because a lot of them will not have school in July, and this class is over in August, so you must get these done early. You're going to be reading about planning and providing special education services in this chapter. And then you're going to move on to another chapter here in a bit. But make sure that you do your discussion board Wednesday, and then make sure that Thursday or Friday you're going on and commenting on a peer's post and or commenting on somebody that commented on yours. When you do your post, I'd like for you to look and see who hasn't been posted to. That way all of you get a chance to listen to what somebody else thinks about your post on discussion board. Make sure and read through the chapter 2 module. You will have the quiz, you will have discussion board, and then you will move on to the next chapter. Make sure that you're staying on track. This week there are 2 chapters, so you'll want to get them done early so you can get on there and get things rolling and don't get behind. So let's go ahead and look at chapter 2 PowerPoint. The first slide in there is to give you an idea of a review a little bit about handicap, impairment, or disability. And what I'd like for you to do on these is, on a piece of paper, write down what your thoughts are. Tanner was born with one of his hands. Does he have a disability without one of his hands? Does he have a disability, an impairment, or a handicap? And then answer the next one. Describe and explain 4 of the 6 major principles of IDEA. List them. Take a little bit of time. Go back in your book, see what you think, write them down. Then list the dimensions, defining characteristics of special education, and describe or explain 4 of them. What this is going to do is get you ready for the upcoming quizzes, help you remember a little bit more on there. And then the next slide, I have the answer. Okay, and I also have the page numbers for you. Then I'm going to have some questions that have come up in the past that you might want to look at and get some information on before you jump to the chapter test or the chapter quiz. The chapter objectives for this are: describe the function of each step of the special ed process, describe the disproportionate representation, identify groups that are over or underrepresented in special education, explain why this is problematic, compare and contrast 3 teaming models, and list the required components of an IEP. Chapter objectives: explain how the least restrictive environment for a given student is not necessarily the regular classroom. Identify several arguments for and against full inclusion. And then name the most crucial variable in effectiveness for special education. So let's start now with the process of special education. The pre-referral is generally the first part. Provides immediate instructional and or behavioral assistance. The pre-referral intervention is conducted by a building-based early intervention assistance team. It also comprises response to intervention as a more formal and systematic referral process. So you've got RTI, response to intervention, and the pre-referral intervention part of that pre-referral. Then you have evaluation and eligibility determination. All children suspected of having a disability must receive a non-discriminatory, multi-factored evaluation. Okay, what this basically means are you're not just going to use one type of test. You're going to use multiple types of tests in order to find out for sure what's going on. The multi-factored, whoops, it changed over here. The multi-factored is conducted by school-based multidisciplinary evaluation team. So each person kind of has their own special part in this IEP process. The next part of the process is the program planning. And I'm trying to get some things adjusted as we go here. An individualized education program must be developed for children identified as having a disability. There's placement. The IEP team must determine the least restrictive educational environment that meets the student's needs. Generally speaking, you're going to start in the regular classroom. Add some accommodations, maybe a few modifications. Then maybe you're going to try a co-teaching classroom where there's two teachers in the classroom, generally speaking, a regular education teacher and a special education teacher. Then you might go into a resource room where they go to a resource room for 30 minutes, maybe 3 times a week or something to get more instruction in the area they're looking at. Or it might be all inclusive in a special ed room where it's a special education teacher teaching math, reading, or writing skills. And then there's more down the line. But those are kind of the placement. But generally speaking, least restrictive environment means that you tried the regular classroom first and then jump down as you go down through that placement. Progress monitoring, annual review, and reevaluation. Ongoing monitoring of the student progress. They have goals. The teacher will be monitoring these goals on a sometimes daily basis. And at least most schools will give a quarterly observation report to the parents at that point. And then the annual review, every year it must be redone or reevaluated to see whether there's some changes. You'll write down the changes the student's done. You'll write down the changes the parent has seen or the strengths the parent has. You will hopefully get to update your goals and make sure those goals are relative and attainable. That's one of the big things too. And you'll start hearing me talk about SMART goals and SMART goals in your book. And then reevaluation is actually another part of that. There's every 3 years the team will look at the data that they collected at the very beginning to see if there's more testing needed. If you're meeting the student's needs, are there some things you need to add? If there are, do you need to do testing to figure out what it is you need to do? But every 3 years, the team must look to see if they need to reevaluate and adjust the student's IEP. There's a link here for initial referral process. I'd like for you to click that. It gives you a breakdown of DESE's referral process. It's going to look for initial evaluation process, the agency referral, initial evaluation process, the parent referral, and the reevaluation process. And this difference between a district's evaluation and a parent's evaluation. If it's a teacher talking to a special ed teacher about a student and they think there might be some difficulties or some problems or maybe a disability suspected, they can talk, they can chat, they can try to find some teaching methods to see if that's what it is. They can do some observations and things to see if that's what they think it is, and they get a little bit more time as they're doing it. But if it's a parent referral, once that parent has talked to anybody in the district saying they think their student is a student with a special need, it automatically starts that 30-day process that we'll be discussing. So always, if you're a teacher, inevitably it will happen during parent-teacher conference. And then all of a sudden it'll be 2 or 3 weeks later the teacher comes to the special ed person. Oh, by the way, I chatted with a parent on parent-teacher night and they think that their student might have a disability. Well, you've just lost 2 to 3 weeks of your 30-day timeline because it started when that parent talked to the teacher on parent-teacher night. So make sure if you're a regular education teacher that you really keep communication open to your special ed department. If you're going into special ed, be forewarned when there's parent-teacher nights. Talk to your teachers and make sure things are going okay. Disproportionate representation exists when a particular group receives special education at a rate significantly higher or lower than would be expected based on the portion of general regular student population the group represents. There's also a risk ratio, relative likelihood of a member of a given group to be receiving special education compared to members of the general population. Risk ratio greater than 1 is overrepresentation. Risk less than 1 is underrepresentation. Like Native Americans is 1.7. They're overrepresented. Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islanders, 1.6. African Americans, 1.4. Whereas Asian Americans is 0.5. So Asian Americans are underpopulated according to this slide. Are children wrongfully placed in special education programs resulting in being denied appropriate education interventions? Are children overlooked because of their membership in an ethnic group resulting in being denied access to needing special education? So you need to look at that. Some of the causes are students from some ethnic groups more likely to have a disability, or do inherent problems in the referral and placement process bias the identification of minority children? You know, you're giving tests that will measure 1 day in the life in time of a student. They may have a good day, they may have a bad day, but it's that test. And if they're not in an environment where they get some of the ideas that the test come from, it might be biased because the children don't have that ability to know what that test is talking about. Those are some of the things. Combating cultural and racial bias. Factors that contribute to disproportionality. Cultural differences between teachers and students and families leading to biased referrals. Inaccurate assessment of culturally diverse students. Lack of culturally responsive curriculum and instructional practices. When you're giving a test to a student, if their language is not English, then you need to make sure that that test can be given in the native language of that student. Otherwise, you're definitely going to have some cultural bias. Solutions require educators to become culturally responsive, implement appropriate assessment strategies, and implement culturally responsive practices that support a multicultural approach to the curriculum and instruction. There's also collaboration and teaming. Special education is a team game. The team plans, delivers, evaluates the program of specially designed instruction and related services to meet each of those students' unique needs. Collaboration. Teachers are better able to diagnose and solve problems in the classroom when they work together. So the expertise of one can be gained by the expertise of another. Coordination, ongoing communication, and cooperation to ensure the services are provided in a timely and systematic manner. In consultation, team members provide information and expertise to one another. Let me go ahead and adjust this a little bit. Some of my slides are not showing everything, so kind of correcting that as I go. Co-teaching. Co-teaching, a general educator and a special educator planning and delivering instruction together in an inclusive classroom. This generally is not a regular education teacher and a paraprofessional. Now, paraprofessionals are great. I would have one in my classroom in a heartbeat if needed. But co-teaching should really be a regular education teacher and a special education teacher, so that the special education teacher's expertise in different strategies that help students with special needs can come into play and help the instructor of the main topic. There's some other forms though, and I suggest you go in the book and look over one teaching, one helping, parallel teaching, station teaching, alternative, and team teaching, and make sure you get a better idea of that. The next slide is hidden. I'm trying to find a video that I can show. This was a VCR tape that I used in the past, and I have not found a good way of getting it online yet. So this discussion I generally use in class, but I thought it'd be good for you to look at and see if you can identify and answer these 4 questions. So definitely look at that and see what you can find. Now the IEP. It's the heart of IDEA and the make or break component of FAPE for every child with a disability. IDEA requires that an IEP be developed and implemented for every student with disabilities ages 3 to 21. And yes, I did say 21. Most graduates around 18. But if you have a student on an IEP, that IEP team will make that final decision. Normally in that last year of, when they're a senior with their peers, they will make a decision. Does this student need to graduate by credits, or does this student need more time and needs to graduate by his IEP goals? I suggest you look really closely at this, and if the student would benefit from staying to learn those goals so that he can be more independent or she can be more independent and able to live on their own and has the skills to get a job, that the team look at this and make that choice. It's a tough one, but what's best for the student needs to happen. Individualized Family Service Plans, or IFSPs, are developed for infants and toddlers birth to 3. So in all actuality, and we'll talk about the IFSPs in a later chapter, they have from birth to 21 that they can have special services, but it is a little bit different for those on an IFSP than an IEP. Here are the team members. You must remember these. Must include the parents. Must, when appropriate, the child with a disability. Generally, most schools are around 16, but generally also 14 might be a good opportunity to start getting that student involved in their IEP. General education teacher, a special education teacher, the local agency representative, that's normally a principal, or in my case, when I worked at the high school, I was a process coordinator, and that's also could be an LEA. Basically, you have the person there that can spend the money if need be. An individual who can interpret evaluation results, that might be a psych examiner for the district. It could also be the process coordinator at that point in time too. And then others at the discretion of the parent or school. It might be occupational therapist. It might be a physical therapist. It might be somebody that the student's family knows and has a valuable input to give to the student. Generally speaking, as a district, you must let the parents know if you're inviting somebody by putting them on the notification of meeting. And generally speaking, you'd like for the parents to do so also, but that's at their discretion. Components: a statement of present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, a statement of measurable annual goals, a statement of how the child's progress will be assessed, and a statement of special education related services and supplementary aids and services. More components: an explanation of the extent to which the student will not participate with non-disabled children in general education classroom. That means there will be times maybe that some students need to be in that self-contained classroom, or may need to have speech or language services from a speech and language pathologist, or needs to be pulled away for that physical therapy or the occupational therapy. Those types of components or issues would take them away from the regular classroom and away from their general education. A statement of any individual assessment accommodations, and those are those assessment, but it also kind of relates to the classroom accommodations that are given. They are written on the IEP, and once they're on the IEP, all classroom teachers need to abide by at least that minimum that is listed on that IEP. The projected date from the beginning, frequency, location, and duration of services. Basically, you're telling the where, the who, the what, the when, and the how. All that is in that IEP component somewhere. Special factors. In the case of a child whose behavior impedes the child's learning or that of others, consider using positive behavior intervention supports. In the case of a child with limited English proficiency, consider the child's language needs related to that child's IEP. And then in the case of a child who is blind or visually impaired, provide the instruction in Braille and the use of Braille unless the IEP team determines that instruction in Braille is not appropriate. And we'll talk more about these individual disabilities as we get into the later chapters. This is just giving you a general idea about the legal part of the IEP. Consider the communication needs of the child in the case of a child who is deaf or hard of hearing. Consider the child's language and communication needs. And consider whether the child needs assistive technology for devices and services. IEP functions to provide teachers and families the opportunity to be realistic about the child's goals and creative in how to meet these goals. Make sure they're realistic. I've seen too many IEPs, it seems like they just copy and paste year after year and very little progress is made. If they're not making progress, then you ought to redo that goal and make sure they are, or redo your strategies to make sure they are. A measure of accountability for teachers and schools, and IEP formats vary widely across state and districts and across school districts. Even within the state of Missouri, there are differences in those IEPs. Inconsistencies between what is written on the document and the instruction the students receive in the classroom, those are possible problems to working with a student with an IEP. You must make sure the general educators know the goals that you have for this student, because they're the ones that you're going to go to also to see how they're doing in their class related to these goals, while you also may work with them in a special ed classroom also. Students' presence at meetings can at best be viewed as tokenism. Well, they need to be there. I've had a student in high school that was autistic, and the parent came to me and before I had the IEP and said they didn't want the student in the IEP because they haven't told them they were autistic yet. Don't do that to the family. Don't do that to the student. When they're 16, you have to have that student in the IEP and have to get that across to that parent that they need to know, they need to understand. General educators do not know the reason for IEP meetings or feel good about the meetings. Well, that comes to communication, guys. I had one physical education teacher in my lifetime that basically told me, I've done my fair share, get somebody else, and didn't come to an IEP meeting after that until I talked to the assistant principal and they had a little chat. But we unfortunately at times have to go by when the parents can have meetings and when we can have meetings, and sometimes that does mean that it's the same teacher that comes to a lot of our meetings. So make sure that they understand how much appreciative you are of them coming to your meetings, and make sure that they know how much you care about what they say about in those meetings. High quality instruction is needed for students to make progress. IDEA 2004 requires teachers to use evidence-based practices to ensure their students receive the highest quality education. Continuum of alternative placements. And you'll see down below a nice pyramid diagram. I like you to see that. But you'll see what we talked about earlier. I'm going to bypass this because we've already talked about that a little bit earlier. But here's some more that I didn't discuss. There's homebound, where the student is at home or in a hospital program. There's residential school, where they're in a residential facility to receive care and services 24 hours a day. There's a separate school, and there's a separate classroom. State of Missouri has the state schools, so some of our students with the higher needs will go to those state school, those separate schools instead of your high school. I know Warrensburg, as the high school, I also took care of our students that were more severe and went to Rolling Meadows in Sedalia, in Higginsville. So you won't have them all the time in your classroom. LRE, we talked about earlier, the closest to the general ed setting as possible. So make sure and watch that. It's very critical. Here is a continuum of services that I'd like for you to look at. a little closer that definitely gives you, least severe versus most severe, least number of students, most students, number of students. So you can kind of see where things are in that. Definitely look at that and help you. Inclusive education means educating students with disabilities in general ed classroom inclusion. The LRE principle requires that students with disabilities be educated in settings close to the general ed classroom as possible, but that does not mean that all students need to be educated in that. And I want you to really read through this book and get that. Read about the teacher stories that are in the book. Gain that extra knowledge while you can to better understand inclusion. For many students, an inclusive classroom and LRE are one and the same, but that's not always so. Cooperative learning activities provide a strategic approach. I used a lot of these in my time there to help the students gain those knowledge. There's group and individual accountability. Also, class-wide peer tutoring is a research-based form of cooperative learning that works very well also. Arguments for and against full inclusion. Confuses segregation and integration with intensity of services. Requires a readiness model. Sanctions infringements on students' rights. Requires people to move as they develop and change. Directs attention to physical settings rather than to services and supports people need. Those are arguments for and against on there. And then very few special educators supports eliminating the continuum of alternative placements in favor of universal full inclusion. There's always going to be students that's not, the LRE is not the regular classroom. We'd love for it to be, but it's not always the case. CEC believes that the continuum of services and program options must be maintained and that IEP teams must make those decisions based on the student's individualized needs. The bedrock of special education is instruction based on individuals' needs, so really watch that. Where does special ed go from here? Well, the promise of FAPE, free, appropriate public education for all children with disabilities, is an ambitious one. There are problems and concerns with the implementation of IDEA. A lot of times there's insufficient funding from the federal government, excessive paperwork, unclear guidelines, and inappropriate grouping of students with disabilities can sometimes be the case. Overrepresentation of students from diverse groups. Lack of training or support for general education teachers when students with disabilities are included in their classroom. If you're a regular education teacher, try to get as much as you can out of this class. I know a lot of times at the end I'll hear, I wish we had more classes where you learn more. Well, I tell you what, you're a teacher, and there's lots of Googling out there you can do to learn. When you have an educator that is their case manager, talk to the parents. They know the student better than everybody, and you'll see in Chapter 3 when I talk about that how important I think the family is in that situation. And where does it go? Special education is at a crossroad. Today, all children identified with disabilities receive special education and related services. The educational outcomes for the majority are poorly on virtually every measure of academic achievement and social adaptation. Good teaching is where it must start. We need good teachers with good strategies that care about all students, whether they're special needs or not. Because if you're a regular education teacher, you will have a special education student in your classroom. I guarantee it. And so you need to look at it now. How can I best teach all students? We'll talk about differentiated instruction as we go. Very, very important at this time. So look at the homework for this chapter. And we'll go ahead and I'll update that a little bit, but you'll look at it. That'll help you along the way. I'll have one for each one of these. So anyway, good luck. Good reading in Chapter 2. And look at the quiz, look at the discussion board, and then go on to the next chapter. This is a two-chapter week, so get going. Talk to you later. If you have any questions, you know to email.